Welcome and thanks for joining us for this other session of the ACM Hangouts. Today we are going to be discussing the very important subject of cultural infrastructure. Here are some more details. In today's session, we are going to be discussing cultural infrastructure with a specific focus on the local context. Together with our guests, we are going to delve deeper into how the current status of cultural infrastructure is affecting expression as well as improvements needed. The subject also needs to be viewed from a wider perspective and considered in a social, economic, and cultural context. We are going to be discussing this in the second part of our discussion, whilst exploring the direct link between infrastructure and communities. So, joining us for this first part of today's session are Adrian Mamo, architect and currently the president at the Malta Society of Arts. Welcome. And Simone Spiteri, writer and theatre practitioner. Thank you for joining us. So this is naturally quite a broad subject and one which deserves a much longer discussion. However, today we decided to focus our attention on two aspects. With this first panel, we're going to be discussing the more traditional aspect of cultural infrastructure in terms of buildings that host and present artistic expression. And then we're going to be moving on to the community aspect and infrastructure within the communities at a later stage. So, Adrian, Simone, my first question is whether the current status of local cultural infrastructure is actually supporting or not the creative ecology. How and why? Simone?
Well, from experience, and not just direct experience, but also from what I hear my peers say, the biggest headache is always where to rehearse. It's never been a straight line, it's never been easy, but I think it's been getting more and more complicated with time. I think like 20 years ago when I had just started out, ironically, it was easier to have a space to rehearse and not just in terms of rehearsals only, it's just a place to be able to use for whatever it is you're exploring. Nowadays, I mean, every company will tell you that that's probably one of the biggest hurdles that they have to deal with the minute there is something that needs space, basically. Obviously, I'm speaking from a theatre point of view, but I am sure that the other disciplines have similar challenges. And also, I think a reason that has made this even more complicated is that we are, I think, operating in a more project-based type of environment, which has almost removed the possibility for artists to just allow a process take the length of time it needs. But obviously, the longer the process is, the longer you're going to need a space for, so it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle and a bit of a domino effect situation. So I would say it's probably one of the biggest challenges practitioners have at the moment.
Facing. Adrian, what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, normally we understand that we're talking about buildings, we're talking about galleries, we're talking about museums or concert halls or theatres. I think that's a bit limiting, especially nowadays, because even theatre since the 1950s doesn't have to take place in a theatre.
No.
It can take place outside. If we look at, for example, I don't know, Edinburgh, where the theatre festival is held, within one little town you have 2,000 plays now, during the month. So I think people have started thinking a bit more than that. Even, say, exhibition galleries, okay, we normally know them as galleries and museums, but nowadays you find a lot of other buildings which are serving the purpose as well. So I think this thing about a cultural infrastructure as being the theatre, the gallery, and the museum, I think is opening it out a bit. So maybe, yes, we need to be a bit more flexible in thinking about these spaces, also because it's a bit of a privileged idea to talk about only an opera house or about a museum, you know. And some people, some artists are not even ready to face such a institutional building. So I think yes, is it a challenge? It's always a challenge. But what I'm trying to introduce maybe is the idea that we need to expand our idea of what is a what is a cultural infrastructure building space. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And what do you think are the direct effects of kind of the current local cultural infrastructure on artistic practice? Someone was already suggesting that perhaps this could impact the rehearsal time, for example. But do you think that it is also affecting the artistic product at the end of the day, what we are producing?
I think we have to make a little bit of a thing, because I agree 100% with what Adrian is saying, but I think Adrian is speaking more about sort of where the work itself is presented, I think, no? Whereas I'm talking about the process that comes before that. I think we are in a, I mean, most artists nowadays are not limited in the sense that they will not put up any work unless it is in the traditional concert hall, theatre, whatever. But I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that the final piece, exhibition, whatever the output is going to be, is only the tip of a very large iceberg.
Yes.
And the part that usually needs the most thinking, the most preparation, the most resources is usually the part of the iceberg that you're not seeing. So I think that it's very simple, but if you do not have the basic resources to actually be in a space, because we're talking space, now that space could be wherever, I think everyone will take whatever is available, you know. But unless you actually have that physical space, there has to come a point where the idea needs to be physicalized, it needs to be explored, it needs to be, you need to make mistakes as well. That is something that I don't think as a general society, I think it's a bit of a worldview. We are a little bit in a society right now that frowns upon mistakes, you know, and I think that is not very healthy, especially in an artistic sense. You need to have the space, figuratively and metaphorically and physically, to be able to try things out, and then maybe they don't work and you keep working on them. And I think we are limiting that process a little bit, and perhaps not actually having the physical space, for want of a better word, to explore that does have effects in the long run, I think, because as I said, I feel that the majority of projects are a little bit of a race towards deadlines. We are a very deadline-prone society in general, you know, and I am sure that if we had to analyze the direct effect it has on what we are proposing as a community, not in a better or worse situation, but in a different way, for sure.
Adrian?
Yeah, I think theatre is probably the artistic practice which is most affected during the creative process. Because if we see, for example, painters, during COVID, which should have been restrictive, we see more painters, because obviously you don't need that amount of space. Or, for example, music. I mean, I was speaking to Tony Santo as his program on Maltese music. This year alone, over 100 new music tracks, and wonderful ones. I'm not talking about pop music, I'm talking about, you know, all types of creative process. So regarding spaces of creation, and also as an architect, I've often done permits for people to this casa bottega sort of thing. So an artist can even practice and create in his own home legally. So in that sense, I think the artist is not limited in his creation. Sometimes it's even probably a bit more challenging, and we find even a lot of new artists now on Facebook, loads of people who started painting in the past couple of years. And even I think theatre companies recognize that they can also use other spaces other than theatres, as we said before. Like
they hardly ever use theatres.
Exactly. So, but during the process, I mean, obviously we've heard a lot of in the past years about projects like the Rock Hub, or the spaces for the for the musicians to rehearse. I mean, it never happened, but you still have bands rehearsing. I don't think anybody's going to say, I'm not going to compose a song because I don't have the art hub or the carnival village. Again, this has been on the cards for 20 years. I don't think the carnival people, I'm going to say, I'm not going to create my carnival floats because I don't have a space. Theatre, I think, is difficult, and you're right. It's probably the spaces that people cry out for most, because you need a certain amount of space. Now, I think maybe part of the problem is that we aren't very good as a country on insisting on professionalizing the arts. Because if I were teaching theatre, then I should also teach and be able to assist people in having all the requirements of their profession. No, I cannot throw you out onto the market and say, now do your plays. Yeah, okay, but what am I going to do? So, yeah, I think this is an important, especially in theatre. Yeah.
Yes. Because at the same time, I think it is also a matter of finding suitable places, especially for music, for dance perhaps, and theatre. So perhaps the space is there, but the problem is that the space is not well equipped for certain kind of expression as well. So I don't know whether that is the problem or how that can be a challenge in this case. I don't know if that is kind of what you're referring to in this.
I think there are many things that need to sort of come together for that type of resource to be sort of respect, as in the sense to be satisfied. I mean, I for one, I have rehearsed everywhere, like literally in places which were fully equipped to be rehearsal spaces, and in places which you will call anything but a rehearsal space. Because I agree with Adrian, when people want to create, they will create, and you will find a way, and perhaps not in the best of conditions, but you will do it. But I think there are a lot of other things. And obviously, I know that I'm speaking for theatre mainly because I'm not a musician, I'm not a dancer, but I would imagine that sort of the dance community has similar, more probably, because they need, for example, special flooring.
Exactly.
Which, as an actor, you don't need. So, I've rehearsed in garages with concrete floors with no problem, but a dancer is not going to be able to do that, for example. But it's not just that, it's just, sometimes it's the availability of a space. So sometimes a space might be available, but obviously there are a lot of people who need it, so you kind of have to share it, and sometimes it's not available at the time you need it. There's also a financial aspect to it that sometimes, especially, I come from the independent fringe theatre section. We don't afford rentals. We're lucky if we break even sometimes when you put up a production, and even if you are partly funded, for example. So you're constantly juggling a lot of these variables, and sometimes that's why at the end of the day you think, maybe we're just going to have to use my living room this time around. But it's not always possible, because it also depends on what it is you're trying to create. Because it's one thing if you're working on a piece which is a two-hander, it's very text-based, it's a small space and so on. If you're working on a piece with a cast of 20, it's something different. Or, if you have big sets. And I would imagine other disciplines have other challenges. But I think we share some of them, the financial part, the availability part. So
also there is this sense, I think, of relying too much on certain spaces, especially not for the creative part, but for kind of the part where it comes to then showing the work to an audience. I think we keep going to the same places in Valletta, so kind of it's very centralized, it's very much focused on that level. I don't know what you think of this, what you make of this, and how that possibly is affecting what you said, what you referred to before, Adrian, this perhaps limiting ourselves to just these few spaces that are offering only these select opportunities.
No, I think that happily a lot of people are getting out of this problem, are solving this problem. Last weekend there was a concert in the Aviation Museum.
Yes.
Lovely space, and not only that, but even exhibitions. We see exhibitions popping up everywhere, in hair salons, in coffee shops. So no, I think that there is a good utilization. If we really look, there's a good utilization of space. I remember 2 years ago when the pandemic came out to talk about theatre. There was only a lot of theatre companies, I think, stopped working because they said, I cannot work because I don't have a theatre. There was one theatre company who put up Shakespeare in the middle of a garden with the restrictions, but it was the only theatre production that year.
So it was very successful.
It was very successful, and I think that if if you want to, you can really think out of the box. I remember when I was studying architecture in the 1950s, Le Corbusier, who was a famous architect, Swiss French, he was asked to design a theatre in his famous building, the Cité Radieuse in Marseille, and with, I don't know, thousands of inhabitants. And he was asked to do a theatre, like there was a bookshop, a coffee shop, and he simply gave a space on the roof with one concrete panel and 3 concrete steps. And his idea was, I'm not going to build a theatre for a company or a theatre producer or a director today, because I don't want to limit his possibilities. And I think this is the approach we need to take. It's more, I think, the problem for, as you're saying, rehearsing and stuff like that. Because producing, I think everybody's quite creative in, also different platforms and online platforms. So I think in that sense.
And I don't think it's a recent thing either. I think the past decade has opened up the artistic community to a lot of alternative spaces, and I think we're also lucky because we have so many of them. You know, I mean, I think the country.
And we can also consider working outside, for example.
Yes, I mean, we have the weather for it. We have the history for it. As in, like, I don't think it's a novel idea for artists in Malta anymore. You know, maybe 20 years ago it was still. A new still exciting, but maybe 20 years ago it was something that we were experiencing for the first time. But now, nobody bats an eyelid about having to go somewhere alternative to watch a concert or a play or an exhibition. I think it's part of the.
Sometimes probability even helps. I remember some time ago there was this big problem because the National Orchestra didn't have a place to perform. And now they're performing all over the world. So I mean, that's one of the
Although I think that is still presents an issue in itself, the fact that the orchestra kind of doesn't have a house where to actually perform
but they didn't
regularly.
Yes, but they didn't disband. They said, we'll take the challenge and do it. And I think that's the way we should look at this problem.
And from an accessibility standpoint, Adrian, you mentioned this before, kind of the idea that perhaps with certain structures, there's a certain parts of the audience perhaps are not very comfortable with accessing that particular space. So do we need to analyze this in order to help us understand perhaps also how to engage with more audiences, with more communities, like going beyond this building and experimenting with new venues?
Okay, so I think people go where they feel they belong. In fact, if we look at theatres, I suppose it's all over the world, but definitely the case in Malta. The Manuel Theatre has its own audience. The Catholic Institute has its own audience. All the theatres have their own audience. And if you go to watch a show or a concert in one, you're going to see totally different people from one theatre to the other, because that's where they belong. Or if you have built up quite a reputation, then if you give a concert, then you can go anywhere. You can travel with your show. So I think it's all it all boils down to a more sort of human scale, and people want to go where they are accepted. So when I mentioned that it might be daunting for people I meant to exhibit, for example. If I'm a young...
from a practitioner's standpoint.
Yeah, from a practitioner. If I'm a young artist, I might feel I don't have the work, or I'm not confident enough to my work to go to a museum. or to a gallery to exhibit on a solo exhibition for a month. But I might go and put my paintings up in a coffee shop. So that's what I meant really.
But is there still perhaps does this pose a challenge to the artists, like these different spaces? Because I think that being such a small island perhaps gives us access to certain theatre, certain places quite easily.
Yes.
There's no gradual build up to actually be performing at the national spaces.
Yes.
So
I personally believe that audience development should always be very high on the list of every artistic body, whether it is an official artistic body and even an independent artist. I think the point to get your work to as many people as you possibly can, to as many different people as you possibly can, is always going to be the objective of every artistic body, because in the long run it's going to be boring if the same people are watching your work all the time. You're not going to grow, they're not going to grow, so I think that is something which is very important. I think we're not mentioning something which in this day and age you cannot not mention, which is marketing. I think nowadays the concept of marketing is one of the most important pillars of every artistic project. We live in that world, love it or hate it, and I think this is where the use of alternative spaces, if used well, can give a boost to the marketing. But I am still, for example, one of the things that still surprises me, because I agree with Adrian up to a certain point that obviously spaces have their audiences. But then I've also personally been involved in projects where, because of the way it was marketed sometimes, or something that happens, it's a series of things that happen, and at the same time you get a section of the audience, and they would be, I have been in plays, for example, and people will tell you, this is my first time in the Manuel, or this is my first time at Spazio Creativo.
Thank God.
But at least better late than never, sort of. But something must have made them say, I'm going to give this a shot, And I think the use of alternative spaces is usually one of the exciting things in a marketing campaign that makes people think, this is a different thing. But I think this is something that we have to really think about, because growing audiences should always be important, something that we have to keep investing in. We should never, even if we have full houses all the time, we should never rest upon the fact because that's not the point of art. The point of art is to reach at all levels of society. But I am still surprised that in a country as small as this one, you still find people who will tell you, I didn't hear about that event last week.
Or I've never
been to this place, or I've never heard of this artist. And these would be people, who have been around for a long time, have large-scale work or large-scale marketing campaigns. So I think we're missing something there. I'm not quite sure what it is.
Also, Simon, I think going back to your point about marketing, it's because also there's this focus, and I think it's not just in the arts, but in general on experiences, right? On experiencing rather than going to watch something. So perhaps that is also affecting the way we think about infrastructure, the way we approach infrastructure, and also kind of then how that artistic work is actually presented. So possibly there this experience rather than just going to a place. Obviously it depends on the audience as well, because if then there's a certain audience that prefers to just be like take the traditional conservative approach and go sit down, watch, enjoy that particular performance or arts exhibition, whatever. So I think there's a bit of perhaps a preference towards that kind of approach, I would say.
I think people go to theatre, and this has always been the case. It's a social event.
Yeah.
I mean, the most disappointing thing was when the theatre is reopened, and you would go, into the theatre. You can't talk to anyone. You watch the play, and you go out. I think this was the most humiliating theatre experience, because really you really go there because you're going to meet people. It's a living and breathing experience, no?
It's true.
I also think, though, that it's a question of it's a culture that I think can slowly be changed in terms of a mentality, because at the same time, the same people who will only go to the traditional building for a theatre will have no problem to buy a ticket to watch a concert in open air in the middle of Manuel Island, for example, you know, just because they associate, maybe there's some kind of association that we're not making, you know. We don't seem to have a problem with attending events which are outside, sports events which are outside, festas which are outside, you know. So I think it's a question of maybe educating ourselves as a community as well, that art is not always associated to the building it is in. Sometimes it is, you know, sometimes it's the space itself which is informing what the work is about. Sometimes the space, especially like site-specific work, the space is a character, you know, it's part of the process. But I think it's to be able to be more open to trying things out. I think we have to educate people, you know, our audiences, that is also part of the experience, which you mentioned, and it's what people seem to want anyway.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. So one last question, from your experience and your perspective, kind of what are those areas of improvement? I know that we mentioned some already, but perhaps from a more like funding and strategic perspective this time round, what are those areas of improvements needed for infrastructure to better support creation, like both the process and the presentation?
Okay, so first of all, I think we have to mention that Malta has always had these things on its mind, and it's not a new issue. And for the past 10, 15 years, these things have been on the cards. And for example, there was the need for a contemporary museum, and now there's MICAS, which is probably I think halfway through the process. A very ambitious project with a infrastructure real building that we lacked. If we look at also the Valletta design cluster, now again, that's long project has been coming along for a long time, and you know, I'm sure it is filling a need. Now these are all very expensive projects because they not only involve the building itself, but they involve running and that's not a cheap thing. I remember, you know, even nowadays people still call for the rebuilding of the Opera House, which is pure madness. Not just because it's mad to build, maybe it's not mad, but it's not feasible. Not just for the material expense of building it, but for maintaining it.
To run it, to actually have.
So I think that you know, we're on the right track. I mean, we're building things slowly because we're not a very affluent country. So. Other things obviously could be tackled. For example, what Simon mentioned, I think this thing about rehearsal spaces is not something which is impossible to achieve, but I think it would have to be looked at from a national side. Okay, because why would I promise the musicians that I'm going to set you up your garages to play, and then what do? I neglect all the others. So I think it should be that we look at things from a national thing and say what spaces are there. I think, and these are, we don't need to make a seminar about this. I think if you ask the key people, they will tell you very immediately what is needed and what is not. So I think that is the challenge. The challenge on the side of the artists is to be creative and, you know, not let these restrictions hamper their creative process and even their expression, and also to inform the people who can make decisions about what spaces are needed. It's not rocket science.
No, I mean, I agree, and I think if I had to add one thing to what Adrian is saying is that I think we have to understand the importance of process, because I think maybe, I mean, we are living a very fast life, which is resting a lot on things needing to be instantaneous, and I think the biggest victim here is the sense of taking your time, because art takes time, you know. And I think once we understand that, I don't think we even need to explain what Adrian said. I don't think we need to explain why you need a space to let your art and your ideas grow if you happen to be in a discipline where your living room is not enough. I mean, still, artists are going to keep finding a way because, as I said, people who want to create will create anyway. But I think that help would be imperative, and I think it would have a definite effect on the quality of the work itself. Then I think that is really, really important, because I think now we have all the formal structures, but we also need to understand that there is a certain fluidity in being an artist, which still needs its resources without it being rigid, you know. And one of them is, I'm reading myself here, but one of them is to have the space, the physical, the intellectual, and the metaphoric space to let it happen.
Do we also need the enthusiasm and the passion back, you think, added to this formula?
I don't think we've ever not had enthusiasm and passion, you know. I think people who are creating work are doing it because their enthusiasm and passion is stronger than the challenges, you know, because otherwise a lot of people wouldn't do anything. I mean, there are still a lot of people who do this after a day of work elsewhere that has absolutely nothing to do, you know. So I think that has never been a problem. But
it's allowing the space for that.
Yes, literally. I mean, figuratively and metaphorically.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Adrian, for joining us today. Joining us for this second part of the ACM Hangout session are Alexandra Patch, founder and director at Blitz, and Elise Tonna, regional cultural coordinator at ACM and also curator and co-creative director at Gabriel Caruana Foundation. Welcome both to the session.
Thank you.
So, cultural infrastructure can also and needs also to be viewed in a wider context as a product of social, economic and cultural activity and also realities. So in this case, from your experience, how is this a more inclusive approach to culture and to the arts? How so? How is it? How can it be so? Alex?
I think you know, the presence of independent, you know, artist-run spaces are kind of a place that, at least when Blitz had started, the intention was always to kind of fill a gap that existed within this sort of infrastructure and ecosystem, so to speak. I think that the ecosystem was lacking this element, this aspect of having this what then started as a more grassroots, you know, DIY, proactive approach to making things happen. Over time, over the years, of course, this kind of would have evolved and would have developed to being perhaps a little less DIY and a little more perhaps sensitive to the way people respond to what is done and how that sort of response can contribute to the development of it, and vice versa. So I think sort of the two things, whether it's how audiences engage in it or how its presence impacts the audience, is this constant like feedback loop to things happening and things changing. I think they kind of develop in simultaneity, perhaps, you know, in coexistence.
And how do you ensure that it's kind of an ongoing process? Because I think that's the most difficult and challenging part possibly to it.
Yes, I think the word ensure is a very ambitious word. Let's start from there. I think we all, you know, Elise and myself and many other people do our best to try to be able to use words like ensure, but I think if I had to boil it down to a very simple approach, is to always believe in what you're doing and to believe that what you are doing is relevant. Because if you simply believe in what you're doing because of how it contributes to your own development, to simply to your own institution's development, then it's a finite way of what impact can be created. But you know, if you kind of believe in what you're doing and how that can be multiplied in other ways by other people, by the people who engage with it, by the people who consume it, or who are influenced to do more themselves, then maybe eventually you can come to a point where you find ways to ensure that it will continue.
From your perspective, Elise.
Definitely. I think we are all active contributors to this very invisible cultural ecosystem, which is composed of multiple parts, and each part is obviously very important, because without policymakers we can't have strategies in place, and without strategies we can't have cultural investment, without cultural investment we won't have infrastructure, so it's all interdependent. The word ensure, I completely agree. Running an artist-run space with limited resources, especially both spaces, the Mill and also Blitz, are also heritage spaces, so there's also a financial burden related to the maintenance aspect, but there's also as well the contributions we make to audiences, and the same, and vice versa. So we also need to consider and be attentive and responsive to the audiences and the programs we try to create, so on and so forth. It's a very wide and broad discussion.
Yes, well, it's true. And perhaps we have the opportunity here to get deeper into the challenges. You're mentioning that there are a number of challenges, especially when it comes to engaging the communities that perhaps surround the space which you run. So what are these challenges which keep perhaps resurfacing every now and then?
Active engagement in relation to communities. I mean, the term community, I believe, is being overused, and its definition is very widespread. You can have the community, which refers to the direct audience who is attending and an active participant in the program. But there are also, in a broader sense, there are communities which also want to participate in what we have a number of invisible boundaries that unfortunately restrict certain communities, and therefore obviously restrict this active participation aspect.
But does the fact that the spaces within these communities kind of help support in that way?
Definitely. Obviously, having a physical presence obviously gives you like a space where people can come, a space where they can feel they are active contributors towards whatever activity, whatever cultural activity that is ongoing within that space. And yeah, so a location is definitely important, and they also motivate. I mean, I believe it's the same. They also motivate and empower you to also create more, because after all, without people, it's useless setting up an exhibition and no one comes, you know. It also helps into reinforcing certain values or putting across certain messages which different entities want to convey. So, for example, within the Gabriel Caruana Foundation, right now we're focusing on emerging artists. So we're giving a platform for emerging artists to showcase their work. We have various communities which are associated to the Mill, whether they are the residents, whether they are previous artists who have exhibited their work there, who follow or at least acknowledge the presence of the up-and-coming artists. So there is this exchange, and this exchange is extremely important for the development of the cultural ecosystem and in the wider aspect of the cultural ecosystem.
Exactly. And perhaps what's your experience with Blitz, also presenting the contemporary art to local communities? Kind of how does that work?
We are perhaps maybe in another part of the spectrum in what we are doing at the moment. I mean, Blitz has been around now for around 10 years. And as an organization and as a program and as everything, it has, to start off with, from day one, the objective was always to be very modular and very adaptive. These are words which are nowadays everybody's words because
these are the
everyone's been hit by a
buzzwords.
pandemic. But they actually, if you look at kind of what statements we wrote 10 years ago, for us that was the real reason for independent spaces, that you can adapt quickly, change without the bureaucracy, without all the with the challenges, but you're quicker to respond. And nowadays, we went through a period of having international artists residencies, so supporting emerging artists as they're doing at the Mill. And nowadays, we are focusing heavily on bringing internationally acclaimed contemporary art here. So, bringing it to people rather than people having to go get on a plane, go to big institutions and museums elsewhere to experience this. So that comes, of course, with its own set of challenges. First of all, just because an artist is super famous around the world, you cannot necessarily assume that the community here knows who that person is.
And wants to engage, perhaps.
Exactly. Making that assumption will only lead to kind of arrogance and almost alienation. So you really have to treat, even if it's like a superstar, like you would treat even an emerging artist. Like there is a lot of education involved. You need to explain who this person is, what they've done. And one of the things which we learned and one of the ways that we adapted very much over the past couple of years was, besides, that we created an online aspect of Blitz, which is set to keep going, we also started to triangulate our exhibitions in our space, the online space, and the public space. So, in fact, our current exhibition by Marinella Senatore has an installation on about a 13-meter, I think, installation on the balcony of Casino Maltese, looking onto Piazza San Giorgio. Big light installation which reads, "Remember the first time you saw your name." And I think kind of that's for us, that is kind of a very important way of us, again, kind of carrying on the ethos that we have in the space of bringing this contemporary art to people, but then also extending it out of the space to almost not give people a choice, but to engage with it, because you can't ignore it. As much as I've just said that, I don't believe in forcefully getting communities into the space. If it's not, I don't believe in engaging with communities as a box-ticking approach. I believe in like, for me, if the student community, for example, is one where I feel my activity has most impact, then I would be happy to focus on that student community, then put, my energy or our energy into engaging the immediate community around the building.
Yes.
If it is not something that our activity is in line with their existence.
Exactly, because I think there is this idea also perhaps from a policy, from a strategic standpoint, that you need,
it's necessary.
It's necessary and you need to do this and do that and tick certain boxes.
I absolutely agree that it is necessary, but I don't think it's necessary for everybody to do it. And I feel that what makes all our organizations function, not only individually, but function together, is if each organization has focus, and if each organization has focus and is dedicated to that focus, then collectively everybody's different focus is actually addressing a broad aspect of various communities, whether it's a student community, whether it's a local community, whether it's children, whatever, But I do firmly believe in that not everybody should be doing everything.
Exactly, and I think what you are saying and mentioning the plural here is a very important aspect, the fact that there are a number of different spaces around the Maltese islands catering for different projects, different focus, so that I think is very important. Also, this idea of repurposing the spaces, I think we are still quite perhaps scared of going for this option, although I'm very much preaching to the converted here, and you did repurpose both spaces. so I think how is this in your from your perspective? How does this help to engage multiple audiences and what Alex said, kind of to cater for different needs, also artistically?
Coincidentally, at this current moment, we're at the foundation, we are carrying out a project called Scopri. And Scopri is essentially the final, so to say, final stages of designing, of bringing together multiple stakeholders to actually kind of consolidate the future of the mill. It might sound very heavy, it actually is part of it, but and it actually has different components, which brings different communities together. First, it has a participatory approach, so we're seeing different stakeholders, the architects, the engineers, the landscape designers, so on and so forth, coming together, the strategist, the business planner, coming together to actually approach the redesign of the mill from different perspectives, but actually bringing them around the table so that they can actually exchange. It is bringing together a community of volunteers who are helping out with the archiving process, with so many different processes that one might not realize are essentially important and are overseen sometimes. But it's creating this community of contributors who are essentially helping out in the, so to say, the day-to-day running of the mill. It is also bringing together the network of local residents because we are, they know something is happening and they are actually approaching us to tell us the different stories of how they remember the last maintenance that was done to the mill, where the underground reservoirs are. So we're discovering so many different stories about the mill. It's actually making it a fun process. Unfortunately, there is a lot of cultural investment that needs to be made, not only in terms of finances, but also the time dedicated towards bringing these stakeholders together. But ultimately, in the very far away future, once everything is ready, everyone is kind of empowered to feel that they were part of the process. So the mill also, like our the predecessors who actually come and say, listen, we were part of this process. I was here painting the door when the last maintenance was carried out. Now we're creating another community of people who are contributing. So it ultimately also enhances a sense of identity and also a sense of place.
Belonging as well.
Exactly.
Yes, that's very important. And on a more general level, perhaps, how can we make better use of resources around the Maltese Islands in order to support artistic practice and engage communities a little bit more? I mean, I get the sense that it's never easy to go through this process, but it is needed, perhaps, also to support the multiple artistic practice. So what can be done?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, and I'm not sure if it's even a surmountable challenge in a sense, is that space has become impossible to access, really. I mean, the mill is a family heritage building. Mine as well is a private property that has been in my family for generations. But if it's not stories like this, how many spaces can you tell me of which have been repurposed because they are given through some kind of incentive or access to property with the subsidized rent, or some kind of making spaces available for applying for, or these incentives have never existed. I mean, funding programs have grown, have evolved, have always changed to address gaps and needs, but the impossibility of access to space because of the way the property market has, exploded into something out of this world, is a very real fact and is a very real problem. And so if it's not projects like ours, then it's always going to be nomadic projects. And if it's nomadic and temporary projects, each time that project has to start the process from the beginning.
Also to guarantee that that space can actually be used for certain artistic practice
and it ends with the project. And then if it's another nomadic project, it has to start again from scratch. So, in a way, like today, I say that since the day I started, a lot and nothing has changed at the same time. Because a lot has changed, like I said, because there are many funding opportunities and incentives and things, and many of us have made careers out of things that we love. But what about the people who are coming now? What about the people who did not start 10 years ago, or however many years ago, or the people who have fantastic ideas and can do something to regenerate the space, but there isn't the possibility for it.
But apart from the financial aspect and the investment, which I agree is very much needed in this case, is there anything else which can be done in order to support this even more, or encourage us all not to be lazy and keep going for the same spaces over and over again? What can be done?
I think there are certain labels associated to specific cultural infrastructure. So, and this automatically creates these invisible barriers. Like, for example, once I was approached by a member of a community I was working with, and this person told me, listen, I will not go to a specific exhibition space and a venue because I feel I am not part of that part of that crowd. So I think we have to appreciate the diversification of different approaches to cultural participation. So, for example, like Alex was saying, they are trying to improve and reinforce contemporary art and the international scene coming over to Malta. At Blitz, we are trying to support, for example, emerging artists. So each and every one of us are, even within the diverse niches, so to say, that we focus on, active contributors to this wider whole. And we cannot deny the fact that there are also other contributors and other spaces which might not be labeled as cultural spaces or cultural infrastructure that are used for cultural expressions. For example, mentioning public space, we take it for granted that it can actually be reinforced. There could actually be more understanding of how public space can make art more accessible. Like, for example, schools. Like, a school has a particular time frame that resource can be used to facilitate artist studios, for example, or these abandoned buildings. They might be used, or incentives are introduced to actually facilitate artist studios, spaces for rehearsals, dance studios, which unfortunately we find it, people who work freelance, especially without a roof on their head, find it very difficult to rent such spaces, and beyond that, to actually create a base, ultimately developing into a relationship with different communities. I mean, without it works all together. So.
Exactly. Yeah. The investment is clearly needed on that front.
Yes, and I think these things, obviously, they contribute to the ecosystem of the locality as well. I mean, let's face it, it's been the age-old story. You know, the artists go to an AR because it's rent is cheap. The artists are there, so they make it cool. So then everybody wants to be there. Gentrification. It's a
Yes.
formula which just happens all the time. You know what I mean? And it's always kind of the same. But unfortunately, with us and with here, the size is what it is. You're going to run out of space. You can't, you know, I mean, like in London, go further east, you know, and sort of run away from the property market exploding. You know, you're going to end up in the sea.
Exactly,
So,
it is.
which
It is
is
what
not a
it
bad
is,
idea.
yes. However, I feel, and in fact brings me to our final question. So the concept of creative placemaking and the relationship, therefore, of cultural infrastructure with the communities. So in this case, how can art be applied in order to kind of to make communities better and for them to be able to support each other?
Hello, so my name is Tiffany Fukuma. I am the managing director of TransEuropulse. TransEuropulse is one of the oldest arts and culture networks in Europe. We have about 140 members in 40 different countries, all grassroots, self-organized, community-based arts and culture centers, established in repurposed buildings like industrial buildings or military buildings, more and more commercial buildings these days. For me, I joined the network last September, so I'm still pretty new in the network. I come from the DIY sector originally, but spent about 10 years in the public sector working for cities and governments. So creative placemaking is this kind of magic word that I hear quite a lot from local governments, regional governments, but also the private sector, private developers who want to create attractivity and use arts and culture and the creative industries as a way to reactivate spaces, etc. With TransEuropulse, this is what we have been doing, regenerating spaces and abandoned buildings in particular, organizing communities and bringing urban transformation through arts and culture projects. But I would say that it didn't really happen magically. And if you ask my opinion, creative placemaking, in my opinion, is really something that stems and starts from the needs of a community. Like, you can't force anyone to be creative, and you cannot really decide that an initiative, especially a top-down project, an architectural project, an urban plan, is going to create the effects that you expect if the community's needs are not mapped in the first place, if the communities are not involved from day one into the planning and the design of any transformation plan or economic development project that you are going to bring to a community. Why? Because they have the expertise of what their location is. They know what people want to engage in, and they know what people need space for, especially. So I often say that you can build space, like a really beautiful space, and we often see that actually happen in cities or in some architectural development plans. Fully equipped, to the highest standards, and nobody uses them. And the reason why nobody uses them is because they don't really answer to any need from the community in the first place, or they are mislocated. People are not going to want to engage in those spaces. So what we see in our network more and more, and how we consider ourselves as creative place makers, is that we are not really makers, we are more enablers. And the new typology of really, like, you know, creative spaces I can see emerge is actually a pretty metamorphic and pretty polyvalent, multidisciplinary type of space that is mixing economic uses, social uses, educational uses, and of course, arts and culture uses. Usually it's spaces that include some public access, you know, children's playgrounds, parks, you know, passageways, streets. It can be just very simple, you know, ways of adapting, you know, the type of pavement that you're using, you know, so that maybe, you know, skaters or dancers, you know, from the community can use them and activate the space. So we think of these spaces are as more like blank canvas that are, of course, co-designed to answer the needs of the different communities that are there. You will find out very soon, you know, if the communities you address to want to organize, you know, concerts, or if they want to organize conferences, or if they want to organize, you know, neighbors' barbecues and dinners and picnics, or, you know, weddings and bar mitzvahs, you know, like there are many reasons why as a community you might need a space, you know, like school meetings or things like that. So once you identify those needs, I would say that, like, you have to think of spaces that can be the most polyvalent possible, to be adaptable to all of these different kind of views, and grant access and trust, really trust the communities to know what they are doing, and not impose, like, you know, a functionality, a purpose to these spaces. I went to a very interesting conference recently by a Brazilian urban planner who is talking about the favelas in Rio, and saying that actually she was mentioning, I think, a micro project of, like, you know, investing money into the communities rather than, you know, evicting everyone and rebuilding. And just by investing a little bit in the community projects, they realized that over the long term, the living conditions, the community had drastically improved. Why? Because as an individual, as a community, you are always going to strive to make your environment better. And this is something that I really believe in, that yeah, we should invest and trust the community first. The projects come after, and they will co-design it with whoever is building that space.
I think that the term creative placemaking obviously has a lot of meaning. And locally it has been applied sporadically, but unfortunately, for example, as Alex was mentioning, sometimes community engagement is kind of a checkbox. Mm-hmm. We have to approach it from a more bottom-up approach, include various stakeholders, especially, for example, even mentioning public art. Public art is, depending what the motives for public art are, you cannot expect, depending upon the rationale, obviously, you cannot expect just to put something in the public without even sometimes informing the artistic community of what it is, because obviously that will create certain movement, not only from different perspectives, obviously, and obviously different comments will be raised. So the aspects related to creative placemaking should be further reinforced by bringing together different stakeholders to bind the different communities within a particular context. Obviously, each context has its own identity, has its own characteristics.
And has its own expression as well, because perhaps we tend sometimes to ignore that communities, local communities also have a very strong cultural expression, artistic expression going kind of, which is very evident throughout all the year, I would say.
Yes, and even like sometimes facilitating the understanding that something is an object of art, an artistic creation, it might not resonate the same with different communities. So we have to keep in mind that even though we might have a specific target audience, there are other audiences who, especially in the public sphere, are going to engage or interact with this artistic creation. So it's impossible to tick all the different communities and all the different stakeholders, otherwise we can never, it's a never-ending story. However, we must try and strive to, as much as possible, engage at least the immediate communities who will interact, because that can only ultimately create a ripple effect and help facilitate the understanding of other communities.
Yeah.
What's your take, Alex?
I agree. Yes, no, I mean, of course, I firmly believe in the good and the benefits from creative placemaking. I do also feel that you can do a lot with a little, and I sometimes I feel that there's so much kind of perhaps how can I say this, like thought and planning and trying to make things very big and trying to involve as many stakeholders, and it can sometimes almost lead to something verging on the intimidating for said communities, you know what I mean? And I'm, you know, as you know, Elaine, I'm a firm believer in the independent. I'm a firm believer in the proactive, in the, you know, just doing things even if they're small, because I do believe that sometimes, you know, small things can have a big effect, and it's better to have multiple small things happening to have this ripple effect, and that Elise is talking about, than spend months, years thinking how on a grand scale to flip over a community and change absolutely the way that they engage with public art, or feeling intimidated walking into spaces. They're intimidated, no problem. Let's give them something else. Let's not force them to walk into the space and really feel like they're doing something out of their comfort zone. Do something small and do something else, and associate your space with that something small. And automatically, with them engaging in that something small and them associating it with your space, is giving this feel-good factor. And perhaps, you know, if not immediately, later down the line, they might, out of their own free will, wish to come and engage with what you do. Well, I think that's probably my ethos.
I would like to thank you, Alex. Thank you, Elise, for joining us today. I would like to extend this thanks to all the participants for joining us today. We really hope that the session was interesting and engaging, and thank you very much for following us.